Hello, welcome to Informa Pharma Intelligence presentation today on hematologic oncology, more than CAR-T. We'll be focusing on acute myeloid leukemia and the upcoming developments and how the landscape looks. My name is Mary Jo Laffler. I'm executive editor for U.S. Commercial News for the Pink Sheet and Script. I'm joined today by Dominique Fontanilla, senior analyst for Data Monitor Healthcare, and Stephen Muntner, Vice President for Business Development and Licensing. Today we'll be talking about the overall landscape for acute myeloid leukemia. We'll go through epidemiology and different patient segments, current treatment patterns, and the pipeline and future directions. Then Steve will talk about immuno-oncology deal activity, looking at major licensing deals and trends for immuno-oncology drugs, as well as activity in leukemia and opportunities in AML. I'd like to just set the stage by going through sort of a general snapshot of the AML space. There's been a lot of excitement over the CAR-T approvals, which really put hematologic oncology in the headlines. I wanted to point out that the broader pipeline has been quite active in hematology. We've seen a resurgence with several approvals in recent years and more in development, including in AML, but overall there are 16 hematology applications under review at FDA this year, including 2 for AML, which is what we've decided to focus on. These drugs show a high degree of both novelty and medical advances, with 10 breakthrough designations for leukemias in the past 2 years. Like many areas of oncology, better science and better understanding of AML is helping to segment the disease, with several new targeted therapies coming. And more innovation is desperately needed. Progress in AML has been very slow. The 5-year survival rate is just 26%. And the standard of care has been the same 7+3 chemotherapy regimen for decades. This cytarabine with an anthracycline. It's a tough regimen to tolerate, and relapse is fairly common. Today, the U.S. market is dominated by generics, although several new brands are entering the market. But there's a lot of opportunity here because many patients don't get chemo. A recent survey by Informa Pharma Intelligence suggests that there's still significant unmet need remaining, which Dominique will review for us in detail. But even with this high unmet need in AML, it doesn't mean that the standards will be low. It's been a challenging space in the past with clinical holds and failures in recent years, such as Seattle Genetics, Karyopharm, and Innate Pharma's lorilimab, which is partnered with Bristol. Overall, oncology remains a pretty difficult field. There's only a 40% success rate in phase 3. When we break that down by individual indications, you can see that the hematologic cancers at the top in purple are generally more successful than the solid tumors at the bottom in pink. While AML has the lowest phase 3 success rate among the hematologic cancers at 36.4%. It still exceeds the overall average for solid tumors in dark pink, which was 34.2%. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleagues for a thorough review of this space and how it's emerging. Dominique?
Thanks, Mary Jo. All right, so second while I get control here. Okay, so just to give you guys a little bit of background on the disease, AML is the most common type of acute leukemia in adults, and it's primarily a disease of late adulthood, with the median age of diagnosis being around 67 years of age. Survival of AML patients is quite poor, and it continues to have the lowest survival rate of all the leukemias. As you can see from this table, the 5-year survival rate of AML is 27.4%, and this is in stark contrast to CLL, where the 5-year survival rate is 84.2%. Survival rates have improved more substantially in younger AML patients due to the improvements in supportive care, but the prognosis in older patients still remains poor. AML is now considered to be a heterogeneous group of diseases, and they commonly feature a growth of immature myeloid cells in the marrow or the blood. And these groups differ, though, in their pathological, genetic, and prognostic characteristics. If we take a look at the epidemiology of the disease, Data Monitor Healthcare's epidemiology team has estimated that in 2017, there were 38,210 incident cases of AML in the U.S., Japan, and 5 major EU markets, with the U.S. accounting for about 41% of the total. And by 2037, the number of incident cases of AML is projected to increase to around 51,480. And if we look at the absolute change in incident cases of AML within these regions, we can see that between 2017 and 2037, the overall cases are expected to increase by 34.7%, with the U.S. experiencing the most change, as you can see on the left of the graph. Now moving on to patient segmentations within AML. According to Data Monitor Healthcare's primary research, and you can see the graph here, the proportion of patients in each patient segmentation is split pretty evenly between newly diagnosed patients who are younger and older than 60, as well as with relapse or refractory disease in the same age bracket, and this is true across the U.S., Japan, and 5 major EU markets. On average, newly diagnosed patients make up around 58% of the AML population, and those with relapse refractory patients account for the remaining 42%. Across all these regions, an average of 53% of patients are 60 years of age or older. So currently, European and American guidelines have been recently updated to include improvements in genetic profiling and the identification of molecular features in patients. And now patients can be divided into 3 prognostic risk categories, which are shown here, and they're based on cytogenetics and molecular abnormalities. They include favorable, intermediate, and poor risk categories. And as you can see by the frequencies, most patients fall under the intermediate category who have a 5-year survival rate of 41%. And they can be characterized by having normal cytogenetics with molecular abnormalities, which include core binding factor AML with a KIT mutation. Those patients in the poor risk category, which accounts for around 30% of AML patients, unfortunately, they have a 5-year survival rate of 14% and have molecular abnormalities, including an FMF-like tyrosine kinase mutation with an internal tandem duplication, or FMS-ITD, which I'll talk about more in detail later, or a TP53 mutation. So up until this point in time, there's been a wealth of information regarding the genomics, the driving mutations, and the cytogenetics in AML. However, the treatment in AML has not caught up. If we look at treatment patterns in the U.S. in previous years, we can see that chemotherapy, specifically standard dose cytarabine and with daunorubicin or idarubicin, as you can see in the top row, that's the backbone in the induction setting for newly diagnosed patients of all ages. When we look at the consolidation or relapse refractory treatment settings in older patients, there's an increased use of DNA methylation agents, vidaza or dacogen. And then in older patients, or those with relapse refractory disease who typically aren't able to tolerate high dose or standard dose chemotherapies, we see an increase in the use of best supportive care, low dose chemotherapy, stem cell transplantation, or enrollment in clinical trials. So in the last 30 to 40 years, the mainstay of induction therapy, as I mentioned, has not changed from standard chemo, even though, as you can see from the bar chart on the right, the number of AML trials initiated each year for the last 10 years has stayed pretty consistent. So if you look at the pie chart on the left, you can see that the cumulative number of trials over the last 10 years, that includes industry collaborators, reaches 777 trials. So we can ask, why has it been very difficult to get targeted drugs approved for the treatment of AML? And after speaking with key opinion leaders, one reason is because this disease is really difficult to treat as compared to other hematological cancers. It's a very fast-growing disease, and it has multiple drug-resistant mechanisms. So that, in addition to poor outcomes and short survival rates, means that these drugs in development don't have much chance to take effect. The other potential reason is from the regulatory side. So if we look at the historical criteria for FDA approval in AML, we can see that the FDA has been really strict in requiring significant extensions in overall survival, as well as having a favorable safety profile. So although you can see from the table that Dacogen increased survival by 2.7 months, it was actually rejected by the FDA in 2012. And after that, even though Vidaza, as you can see from the table, extended OS by around 3.9 months, its development in the US was not continued. The ability of event-free survival, or EFS, to act as a strong surrogate has been unclear. However, last year, Mylotarg was the first targeted therapy to be approved by the FDA based on an EFS primary endpoint, and that suggests that EFS may start to have a more important role in pivotal trials, much like progression-free survival, or PFS, is considered to be a strong surrogate for overall survival in solid tumor diseases. Additionally, the FDA approved ADIFA last year for the relapse refractory setting, and that was based on its own analysis of complete remission data instead of the overall response rate data that Celgene had submitted with its application. The FDA has stated that it doesn't consider ORR to be an appropriate endpoint for regulatory decision-making for the relapse refractory setting. And so from these examples, we can see that the FDA is recognizing the need for new AML therapies and that positive event-free survival or complete remission data are sufficient for future potential FDA approvals in this indication. And in fact, last year, AML was in the news a great deal with many FDA approvals. ADIFA was approved in August 2017 for adults with relapse refractory AML who have mutations in the isocitrate dehydrogenase 2 gene, or IDH2. Pfizer's Mylotarg, as I mentioned, was approved in September for newly diagnosed and the relapse refractory AML setting with CD33 positive expression. Novartis's Rydapt gained approval in April, and that was the first targeted drug approved last year for newly diagnosed patients with FLT3 mutation positive AML. And Vyxeos, which is a lysosomal formulation of cytarabine and daunorubicin, was approved in August last year for newly diagnosed therapy-related AML, or AML with myelodysplasia-related change. So shifting gears now to the current AML pipeline, if we look at data from Biomed Tracker, there are currently 120 drugs that are in phase 1 to 3 development for AML, with 2 drugs that are filed for FDA approval. However, you can see in the graph that the majority are in the early phases of development. Similarly, looking at the companies developing multiple drugs in preclinical to phase 3 and NDA for AML indicates that the top companies with assets in development for AML are Celgene, Novartis, Amgen, Daiichi Sankyo, and Roche. And then if we organize the pipeline by target, we can see that the top targets for drugs in development for AML include the immune system, as well as genetic mutations which result in poor patient outcomes, as I've mentioned, such as FLT3 ITD mutation, which accounts for around 30% of the AML population, as well as the isocitrate dehydrogenase 1 mutations, or IDH1, which occurs in around 6 to 9% of the AML patient population. So delving now into the clinical trial data from TrialTrove, we can see that there are 344 ongoing industry-sponsored trials, and as shown on the graph on the left, 176 or 51% of them are biomarker enriched, meaning that patients are either pre-selected based on biomarker or there's an objective of evaluating or identifying a biomarker. In addition, there are 9 antibody-drug conjugates or 4 bispecific antibodies, which are highlighted in gray in this table on the right, that are in clinical development. And they are bispecific, so they also have affinity for CD3. While Pfizer's Mylotarg is the only antibody-drug conjugate that is currently approved, the other drugs are all in early phase 1 development, meaning that Mylotarg will not have a great deal of competition in the short term. So what do we have to look forward to in 2018? This year, there are 2 drugs which will be reviewed for FDA approval, which are gilteritinib for FTL3 mutation-positive relapse refractory AML, and that is expected in November of this year. And we have Agios' ivosidenib, which is targeting IDH1 mutation-positive relapse refractory AML, and that will be reviewed in August. This year, Stemline Therapeutics has initiated a rolling biologics license application for its CD123 targeted drug, SL401, and that is for blastic plasmacytoid dendritic cell neoplasm, which is a highly aggressive type of AML. And as well, Pfizer's Mylotarg, which was approved in the US last year, which I mentioned, has also gained approval in Europe this year. The Data Monitor Healthcare has also used a patient-based forecasting methodology to forecast the AML market in the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets from 2016 to 2025. And over this 10-year period, the value of the previously dormant AML market will increase dramatically, and driven by projected approvals of at least 50 new therapies. A rise in the prevalence of AML, as I showed with the epidemiology earlier, is also expected to contribute to the growth of the market. The sales of drugs in AML are projected to rise from 153 million to around 1.6 billion, increasing at a compound annual growth rate of 29.9%, with the US being the most lucrative geographic market. Looking at the forecast by treatment setting, we can see that the relapse refractory setting is anticipated to demonstrate the greatest market growth and will emerge as the most lucrative treatment setting in AML over the forecast period, followed by the first-line induction setting. So the significant growth in the relapse refractory setting is attributed to a large number of patients in this setting, as well as a high uptake of newly approved therapies due to a current unmet clinical need. Prior to 2017, there were no therapies available for the treatment of relapse refractory disease, and with patients being recommended for enrollment in clinical trials. And so the uptake of potential therapies in this treatment setting is likely to be high. In addition, if we look at the forecast by drug class, we can see that the FLT3 inhibitors, which include Rydapt, quizartinib, and gilteritinib, are anticipated to make the largest contribution to the overall growth market over the forecast period, followed by the DNA methyltransferase inhibitor class, as well as the IDH1 and IDH2 drug classes. The growth of the FLT class of drugs is due to the larger number of pipeline drugs that are targeting FLT3, which I showed earlier, and to the relatively high proportion of patients who have the FLT3 mutation-positive AML as compared to other known biomarkers in AML. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Steve.
Thanks for that, Dominique. So what we're going to do now is shift gears a little bit and take a look at the commercial landscape of things. So let's just give it a minute here for the slides. Okay, so what we're going to look at is broader immuno-oncology deal activity. So what we're seeing here on the slide, let's first take a look at the 2 graphs in the top of the slide here. On the left, we're looking at the broader immuno-oncology licensing deal volume, so that is not just limited to leukemia. It is all broader immuno-oncology and subtypes there. The graph on the left is showing both the deal volume and the deal values. The volume is looking in the blue bars and the value in the orange line. The sample that we're looking at here is from 2012 through year-to-date 2018. For purposes of this, our year-to-date 2018 is mid-April of this year. A couple interesting things that you can note by this graph on the top left is we really see around end of 2014, early 2015 is really what we'll call the birth of immuno-oncology, or the birth of the immuno-oncology deal here. Again, these are only represent licensing deals, so this excludes M&A, co-promotion, anything else like that. But you can see just licensing deals alone getting very much in vogue. Again, if we look at 2014 there on the top left, we'll see only 16 deals, obviously almost double from the 9 in 2013 and the almost none in 2012. However, in 2014, we did have a very large deal in value, which we'll get into later, where we can see over $20 billion in total deal value that year. Then in 2015 and 16 is where we really see immuno-oncology get hot and this trend continue. While the deal values themselves were not as large, although they still hovered between 15 and 20 billion cumulative over that year, we had 45 and 47 deals, so quite a lot. Then in 2017, we experienced an ultimate peak at almost 25 billion across the 42 deals there. Now, even though this line looks like it's going down in 2018, keep in mind that's only about the first quarter, the first 3 months. So we're already at 14 deals and over 15 billion value. So if I extrapolate that times the 4 quarters, we're looking at nearly 60 deals, and we're looking at also nearly $60 billion. So that's not to say there's obviously some very large deals that already happened this quarter too, which we'll get into in a moment here. But we're not forecasting, you know, it to be on a straight line there with 60 deals and 60 billion, but what we are looking at is a good chance of exceeding what we had in 2017, so that will be interesting to see. If we look directly below that on the left side, we see some key statistics. So over that time period, over 100 billion right now in recorded deal value, across 178 is the end value. That average comes out nearly $1 billion a deal, so certainly nothing to sneeze at. Most of those are exclusive licenses, and there's some with options as well. And what I should note is that this is all worldwide, and the source here is Strategic Transactions and MedTrack, which are informed as deal products. Shifting gears slightly to the right side and just looking at a smaller sample of leukemia deals, the same time horizon here, we're looking at everything the same. So we see some similar trends, but only for leukemia. Again, 2015-16 when stuff heating up, 2017 a peak with 10 deals, nearly $12 billion. And again, 2018, 4 deals so far, putting us on par to potentially surpass 2017 numbers. Now, that orange line does look like it falls to the x-axis in 2018, but that's only because we don't have any disclosed deal values on those 4 deals. So I would not look at that straight. It's not necessarily representative. It's just the fact that they haven't disclosed the deal values there. And again, the box below it, about 21 billion over the time period, 34 deals, and also about $1 billion. And those are because, again, there's some very large deals. What I want to point out specifically here, which we'll see more as we get into the next few slides, is that a lot of these larger licensing deals involve multiple products for multiple indications, either as monotherapies or combinations. So while leukemia may be one of the indications, a lot of these deals include other subtypes of cancer. Some of these deal values may look so inflated. We're going to move to the next slide. So now, what we're looking at is the top immuno-oncology licensees. So remember that chart we looked at on the left side before, the top left. This is broader immuno-oncology, which obviously includes leukemia as well. We're looking at only from a licensee perspective. So who who were the licensees in the same time period worldwide. What we see starting at all the way on the left, we see BMS, Bristol Myers, taking on the lead there with nearly 16 deals as a licensee. We also see a slew of what you expect, the big pharma, Pfizer, Roche, Merck, AstraZeneca, all those guys having multiple deals. Interestingly enough, number 2 position is Celgene, a pharma, but clearly not quite as large as the other peers in there. Then as we move down the line, you see some what used to be smaller players. You see Kite Pharma, which is now acquired by Gilead, MedImmune, which is part of AstraZeneca, Janssen, which is part of J&J, and Juno as well. So you see some other names in there as well. So it's just interesting to see who's really taking place in this space, particularly as a licensee. As I advance, now we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty here of the deals. So again, if I remind you of that top left first graph we looked at, this is broader IO, not limited to just leukemia. What we're looking at here is the top 5 licensing deals in terms of total recorded deal value. So what that means is this includes when they announce the deal, not just the upfront, but all potential milestones, whether they're pre, post-sales, royalties, anything like that, all biobucks. So obviously these numbers may be a bit inflated. As we move forward, we'll see how much of these are hit. But in order to standardize, this is how we decided to report these numbers. So let's take a look here one by one. The first deal, which happened last summer, which is quite a busy period for deals, was between the 2 big pharmas, AstraZeneca and Merck. It involved Lynparza, which is a PARP inhibitor. It involved that Lynparza as a monotherapy, but also as potential combination therapies with PD-1s. Those PD-1s, Keytruda and Imfinzi by Merck. What we see there is what we kind of see along the lines as we move forward. We see actually a decent upfront payment, $1.6 billion, so nothing to sneeze at. But we see nearly 3/4 of the deal value in potential biobucks, $6.2 billion. That's how we're getting the $8.5 billion there. So obviously a lot is backloaded in those biobucks. And again, this Lynparza deal involves multiple different indications. So it includes leukemia, but many other indications as well. As we move on to the next deal, what we'll see, so Merck is a key player in the top 3 deals here. So you'll continually see Merck. This second deal is a little bit different. It's between Merck and Ablinx. It involves a Antibody Alliance. So what it involves specifically is ion channel modulators directed at a number of distinct targets. Again, what you'll see, even here, a smaller upfront, only 41 million, in upfront, nearly 6.7 billion, the entire value in the milestones. Also tiered royalties. So what that means is they haven't told us the exact amount, but they'll be based on certain tiers. It is kind of early stage. It's a research pack, and it is a worldwide deal, which a lot of these are. And there's exclusive rights on that worldwide deal. Some interesting things to note about this deal is it's actually an expansion of something the 2 parties had signed in October 2012 regarding the ion channel modulators directed at immune checkpoint modulators for cancer. So this is actually expansion of the deal. It also includes $11 million research funding during the initial 3-year term as well. Moving along here, again, we see Merck in this third deal. This third deal is a little bit more similar to the first deal that we saw. In this case, is so with Merck and Eisai, so a different player there, and they're agreeing to co-develop Lenvima. This deal actually stemmed off of an existing clinical trial collaboration, that turned into a full-on licensing deal later on. Again, it looks at Lenvima both as a monotherapy and a combination therapy, similar to what we saw with the Lynparza deal with Merck. And once again, $300 million up front, and the bulk in that milestone, nearly $4.4 billion. These are mostly clinical development assets. Again, they're worldwide, and this includes an option. Moving along to the last 2, now we see another big player, BMS, actually partnered here with Nektar. This one's a little different. However, it does also build up an existing prior trial collaboration, this time a 2016 trial collaboration signed between BMS and Nektar. This is really interesting because we actually see the largest split here and the largest upfront payment, nearly $1.9 billion, which is actually higher than the biobucks, even though very comparable at $1.8 billion. So that's interesting. They're actually splitting the values there as opposed to backloading everything, and that's a total of $3.6 billion. Again, it's a worldwide deal, varying phases of development there. Then finally, rounding out the top 5 here is between slightly smaller players. So we're looking at Celgene here, an OncoMed. The interesting thing about this, a little different, it's a stem cell therapy deal, actually catapulting Celgene into the stem cell therapy space. $177 million up front, and again, the bulk in the back end, $3.1 billion. And again, it's a little different. It's interesting because it puts Celgene in the stem cell therapy space. Now what I'm going to do is look at this slightly different. So if instead we in our mind, we shift ourselves to just the leukemia side of things, that graph, now we're looking at the top 5 according to the same calculation method, but just leukemia. So I'm not going to go into the first one. We already touched on this, the top deal in broader IO, AstraZeneca and Merck. And again, this Lombardi deal is in here because one of the potential indications out of many, I believe it's 11 plus, is for leukemia. So again, a little bit inflated, not apples to apples, but we did include it here because leukemia is one of the potential indications. Now, the interesting thing about the next two, we're going to look at Novartis, Xencor, and Halozyme, Bristol Myers, again, coming up here, is that these are what we would consider more platform technology deals where there's a license to platform technology. So the second one between Novartis and Xencor involves the Xencor's XmAb technology, in which Novartis is getting rights to and the ability to develop a range of candidates for that. Again, we're seeing the same trend, very small up front in this case, $150 million with $2.4 billion backloaded in the milestone biobucks. It is a worldwide exclusive deal. The third deal, also another platform technology deal, this time between Halozyme and repeat player BMS. BMS will use Halozyme's ENHANZE technology to try and develop subcutaneous versions of its drugs, and it has the right to license a number of candidates that result from that collaboration. Again, small up front, $100 million, $1.8 billion in backloaded. Then a little different, the last two here. So we're seeing Celgene and BeiGene. This is a very interesting deal here. We're seeing $400 million in upfront and then $1 billion backloaded and some royalties in the mid-teens to mid-20s there. The interesting thing here that I like to point out is this is kind of what I call a duality or a multi-flow agreement. So we're seeing rights and assets transferred not just one direction here, but both. So in a sense, they're both licensee and licensor. So what's happening first off is that there's rights to products being transferred between Celgene and BeiGene, and then also there's assets and property in China that's being transferred as well. So it's an interesting flow that happens on both. So specifically, this is looking at BeiGene's PD-1 inhibitor and ex-Asia rights to BGB-A317 there. That is also in combination with its PARP inhibitor, BGB-290. And then again, remember I talked about the other side of this. So we're also seeing a transfer of assets from Celgene to BeiGene. So Celgene is actually offloading its Chinese operations to BeiGene. So while Celgene gets rights to several of BeiGene's therapies there, Celgene actually offloads its Chinese operations to BeiGene. So that's quite interesting. Then the final deal between AstraZeneca's MedImmune subsidiary and a smaller player, Innate, exclusive rights deal there. Again, $250 million upfront and nearly $1 billion in milestones. This also just told us their double-digit royalties. They didn't tell us the range. That's royalty 10 to 99. A worldwide exclusive deal there again. Specifically, this deal is looking at Innate Pharma's IPH2201 in combination with AstraZeneca's MedImmune, their anti-PD-L1 Medi4736. The combination there. So these are the top deals in each, so it's quite interesting to see how they're similar but also differ. As we move forward, taking a step back and looking at a little bit broader now, this comes from a combination of Informa Pharma resources. So again, MedTrack, strategic transactions, along with pharma projects and trial trove. We're looking at the overall, again, cancer IO licensing, but now as a subset of the disease from 2012 through October 17. So you see lung cancer clearly leads in melanoma. But if you look down the line, about 6 down, you do see leukemia there. So leukemia is pretty high up in terms of number of deal activities with nearly 25 to 30 deals. So it is interesting to see that it is quite up there, and we'll see how it progresses progresses as we move forward. Looking at this slightly different in the next slide on a yearly basis. So again, if we go through about 6 at leukemia, there's that 26 deals. But you can really see how in 2015 it really peaked. Obviously, we don't know yet for 2018. There's a lot yet to be seen. But you'll see that same trend, 2015, that time period really busy. And again, you'll see, lung, melanoma leading, but leukemia even ahead of breast and some of the other ones. So it's interesting. Leukemia is a very active space for licensing. So it'll be interesting to see where that takes us the rest of this year. Moving along here, that final component that we talked about before, the royalty rates. So you have your upfront, you have your biobucks or milestone, and then a lot of times you have this royalty rate component as well. The royalty rate is usually paid on net sales or gross profits as, kind of like an annuity, a percent moving forward. So what we're looking at here is just in leukemia. So what you'll see is the product name all the way on the left side, the date of the deal next to that, and then the source and partner. Source and partner is just another name for licensor and licensee. Source is the licensor, partner is the licensee. The condition, all of these are AML or broader leukemia, and the royalty rate. So the key things to notice here is the royalty rates really vary from the mid-single digits, mid-teens, all the way up to nearly 50%. And that's for a combination of things. Really, it depends on the phase of the deal. You'll see in parentheses in the second column from the right, for instance, A standing for approved, you'll see those have much higher rates. Same with marketed, generally 20%, 30% or higher. In the early phases like PC, preclinical, more in the single digits and teens. So it's a combination of phase of development versus risk and a number of other factors which we can discuss offline. The final component here is to look at what we consider quote-unquote unpartnered opportunities, which again, specifically within leukemia and AML. So using Informa's MedTrack, again, we looked at what we consider to be unpartnered opportunities for products in leukemia. What we mean by our definition of unpartnered is simply put that there's only one company developing that product, generally the originator. It does not mean that these companies have publicly said they're interested in licensing. They may or they may not. It just means that they're the only ones developing the asset by themselves, so potentially they could use a partner. The other important part about this slide is to show you that obviously this is a subset of only about 10 alphabetically sorted of potential unpartnered leukemia opportunities. There are tons more out there. So even though we've seen a crazy amount of deal flow, there are still plenty more unpartnered opportunities that you can go ahead and do deals on. So you'll see a range, mostly early stage, research and preclinical here. For AML or chronic myeloid leukemia, you see some of the smaller companies that are involved in developing it. So again, this is just a few that you can see here and kind of the final piece of the puzzle. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass this over to Mary Jo to wrap up.
All right. Thank you, Steve. I think that's pretty clear. There's a lot of activity going on in IO and leukemia, and a lot of big deals coming as companies continue to look for new ways to fill their pipelines and for new combinations, especially in IO. And that while a lot of these deals look quite sizable, biobucks compose the vast majority of these valuations, so it's yet to be seen really how this will play out and what the payments will look like. Just wanted to wrap up with a few key takeaways from the material that we've presented today. I think it's really clear that after many years of inactivity and disappointment, approval of the first targeted drugs, as well as a promising pipeline in AML, should spark significant market growth. But it is still a highly fragmented market with short treatment durations and short survival, so it will still remain a relatively small market compared to other leukemias. And while a lot has been learned about the genomics driving mutations and cytogenetics of AML, there is a need to utilize this genomic information to improve treatment outcomes for AML patients, especially those with relapsed and refractory disease. One thing we wanted to point out, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has a master protocol ongoing, the BEAT AML trial in newly diagnosed, previously untreated AML patients over 6 years of age. And this is sort of testing out a variety of different targeted therapies, and investigators in the protocols are hopeful it may be possible in the future to secure approval based on small single-arm studies of highly targeted drugs for AML subtypes. But many industry observers expect a more traditional path to approval. And in the near term, drug developers will need to provide rigorous statistical evidence of a survival benefit without compromising a patient's safety to reach the U.S. market. Furthermore, the disease has a very varied population, so regulators are looking to see that arms in a randomized trial are stratified by baseline characteristics, for example, that they have similar ages and cytogenetic abnormalities. With more drugs coming to market, reimbursement may become a challenge. Already, the UK's NICE has pushed back on cost effectiveness, and the Hospital Administration of Mylotarg may face issues with the DRG cap. So just setting the stage for the rest of the year, here are a few things to keep an eye on. CAR-T is certainly advancing. There's early stage data presented at ASH for several of these programs, and more will be featured this December. There are other new approaches to keep an eye on, including other immuno-oncology mechanisms like BioLineRx's CXCR4 chemokine receptor antagonist, which has immune priming and direct anti-cancer effects and is moving into a pivotal phase 3 trial for AML. Amgen is also aggressively pursuing AML as a target for its bispecific T-cell engagers, a new modality that has worked in CLL with Blincyto, the first drug out of Amgen's platform. And antibody-drug conjugates offer another approach. ImmunoGen will be presenting data on two differently targeted ADCs at ASH in December. There are a couple potential approvals to come this year: Agios's ivosidenib and Astellas' gilteritinib, which is pending at FDA and could be the first of the second-generation FLT3 inhibitors. So those would be joining Novartis' Rydapt on the market. Daiichi's quizartinib is also nearing the regulatory filing stage, and ARIG coming a bit behind that. Roche AbbVie's hematologic drug Venclexta is now in 2 phase 3 trials in AML, with 2 phase 3 ongoing, and already seen promising evidence from that at ASH last year. Agios is hoping to follow up on approval for relapsed refractory AML for ivosidenib with a move into first-line use, where it is testing the IDH1 inhibitor in various combinations, and also for the frontline setting, Pfizer is running the phase 3 BRIGHT trial for its move-in inhibitor, glasdegib. So a lot of change is coming that hopefully will address some of the unmet needs in this space. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions, please visit any of our websites and select the icon for Ask the Analyst. You can submit questions there, and one of our experts will get back to you. Thank you for your attention.